Sherlock Holmes and the Cult of the Crimson Star, a cozy cosmic mystery sleep story. Welcome, dear traveller, to this quiet corner of the evening where mysteries unfold like petals in moonlight, and the world beyond your wills in moonlight, and the world beyond your window fades into soft shadow. Tonight, we journey together into the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where fog curls around lampposts and secrets whisper through cobblestone alleys. This story is designed to help you drift peacefully into sleep, to slow the racing thoughts of your day, and to carry you gently into dreams on the wings of mystery and wonder. There is no urgency here, no demand for your attention beyond what feels comfortable. Simply let the words wash over you like a warm tide. And if sleep finds you before our tale concludes, then our purpose is beautifully fulfilled. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, a persistent whisper against the windows of 221B Baker Street that had become almost indistinguishable from silence itself. Inside, the sitting room glowed with the amber warmth of gaslight and the dancing flames of a coal fire that crackled softly in its ornate Victorian grate. The air carried the mingled scents of pipe tobacco, old leather, and the faint vanilla sweetness of aging paper from the countless volumes that lined the walls in floor-to-ceiling bookcases, their spines creating a tapestry of burgundy, forest green, and midnight blue. I sat in my customary chair, a worn leather armchair that had moulded itself to my form over countless evenings, positioned at an angle that allowed me to observe both the fire and my companion. Sherlock Holmes occupied the chair opposite, his long frame folded with that peculiar grace he possessed, somewhere between relaxation and coiled readiness. His grey eyes reflected the firelight as he gazed into the flames, his fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, lost in whatever labyrinth of thought currently occupied his remarkable mind. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its steady rhythm, each soft sound marking the passage of this quiet November evening in the year 1891. Outside, London breathed its evening breath, the distant clatter of a hansom cab on wet cobblestones, the muffled call of a street vendor closing his stall, the low horn of a river barge navigating the Thames through the curtain of rain. But here, in this sanctuary of warmth and contemplation, the world seemed very far away indeed. I had just set down the medical journal I had been attempting to read, finding my attention drifting instead to the mesmerizing patterns the firelight created on the ceiling, the way shadows stretched and contracted like living things, dancing their eternal dance between illumination and darkness. Holmes stirred, reaching for the teapot that rested on a small table between our chairs. The porcelain made the softest whisper as he lifted it, pouring a fresh cup with movements that were precise yet somehow meditative. Steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying with it the fragrance of Earl Grey, that distinctive bergamot note mingling with the room's other scents. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the fire, and I found myself wondering what connections his extraordinary mind was forging in the silence. What distant dots were being joined by invisible threads of logic and intuition. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low and contemplative, breaking the comfortable silence with the gentleness of a stone dropped into still water. "Do you believe in coincidence?" It was not an unusual opening for Holmes, these philosophical queries that emerged from his silences like fish rising to the surface of a dark pond. I considered the question, listening to the rain's steady percussion against the window panes. I suppose I believe that some events occur without deliberate connection, I replied carefully, though I know you often find patterns where others see only random chance. A faint smile touched his thin lips. Random chance, he murmured, almost to himself. Yes, the refuge of the unobservant mind. And yet... He paused, taking another slow sip of his tea. I confess to finding myself troubled by a most peculiar series of events, Watson. Events which on the surface bear no relation to one another, yet which whisper to me of hidden architecture, of design masquerading as chaos. Before I could inquire further, a sound reached us from below, the sharp rap of the door knocker, impossibly clear, despite the rain and the late hour. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs, slower than usual, and when she appeared in our doorway, her usually composed features showed a hint of uncertainty. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "there is a visitor, a Miss Cordelia Ashworth. She apologizes for the lateness of the hour, but she says..." Mrs. Hudson glanced at the card in her hand. "She says it concerns the stars falling from their courses." Holmes was on his feet instantly, though his movement held none of the abruptness such speed might suggest. Rather, it was like watching water flow upward, inevitable and fluid. "The stars," he repeated quietly, and something in his tone made the words sound significant, in a way I could not yet fathom. "By all means, Mrs. Hudson, show Miss Ashworth up, and perhaps some fresh tea. She will be cold and wet from her journey." Our landlady withdrew, and Holmes moved to stand before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp and thoughtful against the flames. "You asked me about coincidence, Watson," he said. "Miss Ashworth is the third visitor in as many weeks to speak of stars in contexts that should hold no astronomical significance whatsoever. A banker concerned about theft, a widow inquiring about her husband's death, and now this." The door opened again, and Miss Cordelia Ashworth entered our sitting room like a figure from a pre-Raphaelite painting, stepping from its frame into reality. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair damp from the rain, and pinned in a style that spoke of hurried arrangement. Her cloak, a deep burgundy wool, showed signs of quality despite its dampness, and her eyes, a remarkable shade of amber that caught the firelight, held an intelligence that immediately commanded respect. She moved with a kind of contained grace, the bearing of someone accustomed to navigating both drawing rooms and difficult circumstances with equal aplomb. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice steady, despite what must have been considerable distress that drove her to venture out on such a night. "I apologize for imposing at this unconscionable hour, but I find myself in circumstances that allow for neither delay nor conventional propriety." She accepted the chair Holmes offered, close to the fire, and gratefully took the cup of tea Mrs. Hudson provided. Before discreetly withdrawing once more, Holmes resumed his seat, his attention now entirely focused on our visitor, with that peculiar intensity that made one feel as though one were the only person in existence. "You mentioned stars, Miss Ashworth," he said gently. "Please, take your time. Begin wherever feels most natural, and let the story unfold as it will." Miss Ashworth wrapped her hands around the teacup, seeking its warmth, and gazed into the fire for a long moment, as though gathering her thoughts from the dancing flames. Outside, the rain continued its eternal conversation with the city, and somewhere far off, a church bell tolled the hour. 10 deep, resonant notes that seemed to mark the threshold between the ordinary world and the realm of mystery into which we were about to step. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. My uncle, she began at last, her voice soft but clear. Professor Edmund Ashworth is, or perhaps was, an astronomer of some renown. He maintained a private observatory in Yorkshire, near the village of Thornfield Cross, where he spent his years charting the heavens and contemplating the mysteries of the cosmos. She paused, taking a small sip of tea. 3 weeks ago, he sent me a letter. It was not like his usual correspondence, those cheerful, rambling epistles filled with wonder at the universe's vastness. This letter was different, urgent. He wrote of having made a discovery, something he called the key to the Crimson Star, and he begged me to come to Yorkshire immediately. But before I could arrange passage, a second letter arrived. She reached into her reticule and withdrew an envelope, its paper fine but stained, as though it had been exposed to moisture. Holmes took it with careful fingers, extracting the letter within and holding it toward the firelight to read. His grey eyes moved across the lines with that rapidity that suggested he was absorbing not merely words, but layers of meaning, context, implication. "The pattern is clear now," Holmes read aloud, his voice taking on a quality of someone translating from a distant tongue. "What I mistook for celestial coincidence reveals itself as deliberate arrangement. They watch from the spaces between. The cult of the Crimson Star knows I have discovered their purpose. If anything should happen to me, trust no one in Thornfield Cross. The answer lies in the oldest stone, where earth meets sky, where they performed their first devotion to the crimson light." Holmes lowered the letter, his expression thoughtful. "When did you last hear from your uncle, Miss Ashworth?" "Not since that letter arrived 16 days ago," she replied, and now her voice carried the weight of fear held carefully in check. "I travelled to Yorkshire immediately, but when I reached his observatory, I found it abandoned. Not merely empty, Mr. Holmes, but abandoned with a peculiar deliberateness, as though he had departed mid-observation, his telescope still pointed at a particular quadrant of sky, his notes scattered across his desk, a cup of tea still sitting beside his chair, long gone cold. The locals in Thornfield Cross claim ignorance, but there is something in their manner, a reticence that feels less like natural rural suspicion and more like," she searched for the word, "fear. Practiced, careful fear." The fire crackled softly, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly before fading into darkness, and I found myself drawn into the mystery despite, or perhaps because of, its peculiar, unsettling nature. Holmes sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers once again steepled beneath his chin, his eyes reflecting not merely firelight now, but the inner illumination of a mind at work, constructing theories, testing possibilities, following threads through the darkness toward whatever truth lay hidden at their convergence. "Miss Ashworth," Holmes said finally, his voice emerging from contemplation like dawn breaking over a landscape shrouded in mist. "I should very much like to examine this observatory of your uncle's, and to speak with the villagers of Thornfield Cross, however reticent they may prove. Watson, I trust you can spare a few days for a journey northward. The Yorkshire moors in November possess a particular melancholy beauty that I believe you would find restorative." I nodded my agreement, already feeling the familiar stirring of anticipation that preceded our adventures, that sense of standing on the threshold of something unknown and compelling. Miss Ashworth's relief was palpable, her shoulders releasing tension I had not fully realized she carried. "I have taken rooms at the Thornfield Inn," she said. "It is humble, but the proprietress seems kind, if guarded. I can arrange accommodations for you both." Holmes rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain to gaze out at the rain-slicked street below, where gaslight created pools of amber illumination in the darkness. "We shall depart on the morning train," he said softly, almost as though speaking to the night itself rather than to us. "The 11:15 from King's Cross will serve admirably. Miss Ashworth, I recommend you return to your own lodgings and rest. The investigation ahead will require clarity of mind, and you have already taxed yourself considerably with worry and travel." After Miss Ashworth had departed, wrapped once more in her burgundy cloak and accompanied by the hansom cab, Holmes had insisted upon calling for her. Despite her protests, my friend returned to his chair and sat gazing into the fire with an expression I had learned to recognize. The look of a man assembling pieces of a puzzle, whose full picture remained tantalizingly obscured. The rain had softened to a gentle susurration, more felt than heard, a whisper of water against glass that seemed to encourage introspection. "You find this case intriguing," I observed, reaching for my own neglected tea and finding it had grown lukewarm, though still pleasant enough to drink. "I find it troubling," Holmes corrected gently, his long fingers drumming a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the arm of his chair. "3 separate clients, Watson, each bringing me puzzles that seem entirely unrelated in their particulars, yet each making reference to stars, to crimson lights, to patterns they cannot quite articulate but feel compelled to mention. The banker who reported his safe cracked spoke of finding a curious symbol drawn in red chalk on the vault door, a 5-pointed star within a circle, with what appeared to be astronomical notations at each point. The widow, whose husband died in what the police ruled an accident, mentioned finding star charts hidden in his study, marked with crimson annotations, despite his having no known interest in astronomy. And now, Professor Ashworth, a genuine astronomer, speaks of a crimson star and a cult that watches from the spaces between. He paused, and in that pause, the fire settled with a soft collapse of coals, sending up a small constellation of sparks that drifted upward like tiny, short-lived stars seeking their celestial brothers. Holmes watched them with an expression that might have been either contemplation or something approaching unease, rare enough in him to be notable. "There is an architecture here, Watson," he continued, his voice taking on that quality of musing aloud that I had learned often led to his most profound insights. "A design that feels both ancient and immediate, as though something long dormant has begun to stir. The rational mind recoils from such melodramatic formulations, and yet the facts remain. Facts that whisper of coordination, of purpose, of something that uses the language of the heavens to write messages meant for earthly eyes." The morning arrived grey and subdued, the rain having finally exhausted itself in the night, leaving behind a city washed clean and glistening beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Our preparations were efficient. Holmes travelled light, preferring mental acuity to material comfort, and by 10:30 we found ourselves in a hansom cab rattling toward King's Cross Station, the streets still slick with yesterday's deluge, reflecting the passing world in liquid distortions. King's Cross met us with its characteristic cacophony. The great arched iron and glass roof amplifying every sound into a symphony of departure and arrival. Steam from the locomotives drifted in great clouds through the cavernous space, catching the weak November sunlight that filtered through the high windows and transforming it into something almost mystical, a luminous fog through which dark figures moved like shadows in a dream. The smell was distinctive and oddly comforting. Coal smoke, hot metal, damp wool, and that peculiar station perfume of oil and industry, mixed with the tea and pastries being sold by vendors who called their wares in voices worn smooth by repetition. We found Miss Ashworth waiting on the platform beside the Yorkshire-bound train, its dark green carriages stretching away into the steam like a mechanical serpent. She looked more composed this morning, though shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a night less restful than Holmes had prescribed. We boarded a first-class compartment that proved blessedly empty save for ourselves, its interior panelled in warm mahogany with plush seats upholstered in deep blue velvet that had faded slightly with use into something even softer and more inviting. As the train began its departure, that peculiar lurch and gradual acceleration that always felt like the earth itself deciding to move beneath you. Holmes settled into the corner seat and immediately withdrew a sheaf of papers from his coat, documents he must have retrieved from his indexes during the night. I positioned myself opposite, while Miss Ashworth took the seat beside the window, her gaze turning outward as London began to slip away, its endless terraced houses and smoking chimneys giving way gradually to the first hints of countryside. The rhythm of the rails created its own music, a steady percussion that varied in pitch and tempo as we crossed bridges and passed through cuttings. The sound sometimes loud and immediate, sometimes distant and muffled. It was a hypnotic cadence, and I found myself relaxing into it, watching the landscape transform beyond the window, fields appearing, still green despite the season, divided by ancient hedgerows and stone walls that had marked boundaries for centuries. Occasionally, we would pass through a village, its church spire reaching skyward, its clustered cottages sending up lazy spirals of smoke that dispersed into the grey sky. "Your uncle," Holmes said, not looking up from his papers, his voice pitched to carry over the train's song without jarring the compartment's peaceful atmosphere, "was associated with the Royal Astronomical Society, I presume." "He was," Miss Ashworth confirmed, drawing her attention back from the window, though he had become somewhat reclusive in recent years. He preferred his private observations to institutional politics. He used to say that the great observatories had become too concerned with cataloguing what they could see and had lost interest in contemplating what they could not. Holmes made a small sound of interest, a philosopher as much as a scientist, and in his letters prior to the troubling ones, did he ever mention this crimson star specifically, or any unusual observations? Miss Ashworth considered this, her brow furrowing slightly in concentration. A waiter from the dining car chose this moment to pass through, and Holmes paused to order tea for us all. A brief domestic interruption that somehow made the extraordinary nature of our journey feel more grounded, more real. The man withdrew with a slight bow, and the sound of his progress continued down the corridor, that particular shuffling walk one develops on moving trains. "He mentioned anomalies," Miss Ashworth said slowly, as though retrieving memories from some carefully organized mental archive. objects in the sky that appeared and disappeared without following predictable orbits. He called them wandering lights, and seemed to find them both fascinating and troubling. In one letter, this would have been perhaps 6 months ago, he wrote that he had begun to detect a pattern in their appearances, that they seemed to correlate with certain dates, though he did not specify which dates or what the correlation might signify. The tea arrived, brought by the same attendant on a small tray with surprising steadiness given the train's movement. The porcelain clinked softly as he arranged the cups, the pot, the small jug of milk, and a bowl of sugar cubes. Steam rose from the freshly poured cups, and I found myself grateful for the warmth, for outside the landscape had grown more stark, more austere, as we travelled north into regions where winter arrived early and lingered long. Holmes accepted his cup with a murmur of thanks and sat holding it, not drinking, simply letting the warmth seep into his hands while his mind clearly worked elsewhere. Dates, he murmured, patterns, the movements of the heavens reduced to schedule and ceremony. It suggests not merely observation, Miss Ashworth, but anticipation, preparation. One does not watch the stars simply to admire their beauty when one marks their positions with such precision. The Yorkshire landscape unfolded beyond our window, like pages from an ancient book written in earth and stone, each chapter revealing a terrain more wild and haunting than the last. As our train carried us deeper into the North Country, the gentle domesticated fields of the Midlands gave way to something altogether more primordial. Vast expanses of moorland stretched beneath the grey sky, their surfaces textured with heather and gorse, interrupted by dark outcroppings of millstone grit that pushed through the thin soil like the bones of the earth itself, showing through worn fabric. The sky hung low and heavy, not quite raining, but pregnant with moisture that blurred the distant horizon into soft obscurity, making it difficult to discern where land ended and cloud began. I found myself mesmerized by the passing scenery, by the way isolated farmsteads appeared and disappeared, their stone walls the same grey as the sky, as though they had grown from the land rather than been built upon it. Sheep dotted the hillsides in small clusters, their wool gone yellowish with the season, and occasionally we would pass a cluster of trees bent all in one direction by prevailing winds, their twisted forms suggesting years of patient resistance against invisible forces. There was a beauty here, certainly, but it was the beauty of desolation, of vast empty spaces where human presence felt tenuous and temporary against the enduring patience of rock and sky. Holmes had fallen into one of his contemplative silences, his tea forgotten and growing cold in his hands, his grey eyes fixed on something that existed only in the architecture of his thoughts. Miss Ashworth, too, had grown quiet, her gaze turned inward as the landscape of her memories, no doubt, overlaid the physical terrain beyond the window. The train's rhythm had become almost subliminal now, a constant presence that one no longer actively heard, but felt instead as a kind of pulse, the mechanical heartbeat of our journey north into mystery. We changed trains at York, a brief interlude in that magnificent station, with its curved roof spanning the platforms like a cathedral devoted to the religion of modern transport. The afternoon had progressed further than I had realized, the weak sunlight already beginning its early winter decline toward evening. Our connection was a smaller, more local service, its carriages less refined than those we had left, but possessed of a certain honest functionality that seemed appropriate to the rugged country into which we now ventured. This train moved more slowly, stopping frequently at small stations that served villages invisible from the tracks, announced only by weathered signs and the occasional waiting figure standing patient beneath the platform's minimal shelter. The light faded gradually as we travelled, that particular quality of autumn twilight that seems less a transition than a state of being, neither day nor night, but something suspended between them, a threshold time when the world holds its breath. Holmes stirred as we began to slow for what the conductor announced as Thornfield Cross, and I saw his attention sharpen, his posture shifting from repose to readiness in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Through the window I could make out the village taking shape in the gathering dusk, a cluster of stone buildings arranged around what appeared to be a green, a church spire rising above them like a finger pointing toward the darkening sky and beyond, visible on a higher elevation to the east, a small domed structure that could only be Professor Ashworth's observatory, its white painted surface luminous against the moorland's darker tones. The train shuddered to a complete stop with a final exhalation of steam that drifted past our window like a departing spirit. We gathered our modest luggage and descended to a platform that consisted of little more than a raised strip of concrete, its surface cracked and colonized by persistent weeds that grew in the fissures. The air struck cold after the warmth of the carriage, carrying with it the scent of peat smoke and the particular mineral smell of moorland water, along with something else, a kind of stillness that felt almost watchful, as though the very landscape were aware of our arrival and reserving judgment. A single porter, an elderly man with a weather-carved face and eyes the colour of the sky above us, moved forward to help with our bags, his movements economical and practised. "Thornfield Inn?" he asked, his accent thick with the local burr, making the simple words sound almost melodic. When Miss Ashworth confirmed this, he nodded slowly. "Aye, Mrs. Blackwood will have rooms ready for thee. It's not far, straight along the main road, past the church, can't miss it." As we walked into the village proper, our footsteps echoing on the cobbled street, I became increasingly aware of the silence that seemed to envelop Thornfield Cross. It was not the peaceful quiet of a rural community settling into evening, but something more profound, more deliberate. Curtains twitched in windows as we passed, and twice I caught sight of faces withdrawing quickly from view, as though our presence was expected yet unwelcome, a complication in some carefully maintained order. The village green was dominated by an ancient stone cross, weathered by centuries until its carved details had become suggestions rather than declarations, its presence somehow both comforting and ominous in the failing light. The church beside it was Norman in origin, its squared tower solid and enduring, its small windows dark now as evening deepened. I could see a graveyard extending behind it, headstones tilting at various angles, some so old their inscriptions had been erased by wind and rain and time. The Thornfield Inn revealed itself as a substantial building of local stone, 3 stories tall with small windows that glowed warmly with lamplight, smoke rising from multiple chimneys to merge with the gathering darkness above. A painted sign depicting a crossed thornbush swung gently in the light breeze that had risen with sunset, its hinges creaking rhythmically, a sound that seemed amplified in the surrounding quiet. As we reached the door, it opened before Holmes could knock, and a woman appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm interior light. Mrs. Blackwood proved to be a handsome woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron grey hair pulled back severely from a face that might once have been beautiful, and remained striking, her eyes dark and intelligent, missing nothing as she took in our party with a single comprehensive glance. "Miss Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying the same melodic burr as the porter's, but somehow more refined. "I have your friends' rooms prepared. Come in, come in. The evening grows chill." The interior of the inn wrapped around us like a warm embrace after the cold watchfulness of the village street. The entrance hall led to a low-ceilinged common room where a fire burned vigorously in a massive stone hearth, its dancing light playing across dark wooden beams and whitewashed walls, decorated with hunting prints and dried flowers. The smell of cooking meat and fresh bread drifted from somewhere deeper in the building, making me realize how long it had been since our modest breakfast in London. Mrs. Blackwood showed us to our rooms with efficient hospitality, small chambers but scrupulously clean, with thick walls that promised warmth and privacy. Holmes and I were given adjoining rooms on the second floor, with Miss Ashworth's situated at the hall's far end. Each room held simple furnishings: a bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small desk and chair, and a window that looked out over the village rooftops toward the moors beyond. Through my window, I could just make out the observatory's pale dome against the darkening sky, and I found myself wondering what secrets it might hold, what mysteries Professor Ashworth had uncovered in his solitary vigil beneath the stars. When we reconvened in the common room for supper, we found ourselves the only guests, seated at a table near the fire, while Mrs. Blackwood served a simple but excellent meal: roasted lamb with potatoes and root vegetables, accompanied by thick slices of brown bread and strong local ale. She moved with quiet efficiency, speaking little but observing much, and I noticed how her gaze would occasionally drift toward the window, as though checking for something or someone in the darkness beyond. Holmes ate sparingly, his attention clearly divided between the meal and his observations of our hostess and the inn itself. When Mrs. Blackwood returned to clear our plates, he spoke with casual politeness. "A lovely village, Mrs. Blackwood, though remarkably quiet for an evening hour. Is this typical of Thornfield Cross?" Something flickered across her face, concern or perhaps warning, before her expression settled back into professional neutrality. "We keep early hours here, Mr. Holmes," she said carefully. "The moors are not kind to night wanderers, and folk have learned the wisdom of their firesides once darkness falls. And Professor Ashworth," Holmes continued gently, as though the question were merely conversational, "I understand he maintained the observatory on the eastern ridge. Did he too keep to his fireside, or was he an exception to this rule?" Mrs. Blackwood's hands stilled on the stack of plates she held, and for a moment I thought she would refuse to answer. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, despite there being no one else present to overhear. "The professor was a good man, a kind man, but he looked too long at things not meant for mortal eyes. Some knowledge carries its own price, Mr. Holmes, and the stars." She paused, and in that pause the fire crackled sharply, sending up a shower of sparks. "The stars have been strange of late. Red lights where no red should be. Patterns in the sky that feel like eyes watching. The old folk remember stories, you see. Stories of when the crimson star last appeared, and what followed after. The fire's warmth seemed to diminish in the wake of Mrs. Blackwood's words, as though the very air in the room had contracted around that phrase, the crimson star, leaving us suspended in a pocket of cold comprehension. Holmes leaned forward, Slytomes leaned forward slightly, his entire being focused on our hostess with that peculiar intensity that could make even the most reticent soul feel compelled to speak, to share what they knew, despite every instinct toward silence. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying with it the lonely sound of the moors at night, that vast emptiness pressing against the warm sanctuary of human habitation. "These stories," Holmes said softly, his voice pitched to soothe rather than probe, to invite confidence rather than demand it. "When did they originate? Are they recent tales, or do they reach back further into the village's history?" Mrs. Blackwood set down the plates she had been holding, her hands now free to twist together in a gesture that spoke of anxiety long held in check. She glanced toward the window again, then back to us, and I could see the struggle playing out across her features, the desire to speak warring with fear of consequences unknown. "My grandmother spoke of it," she said at last, her voice carrying the weight of inherited memory, of stories passed down through generations like precious and terrible heirlooms. "She was but a girl when it last appeared, in the autumn of 1833. A star that should not have been there," she said, red as fresh blood, visible even through cloud and mist, hanging low on the eastern horizon. And with it came visitors, strangers who gathered at the old stone circle on Crimson Fell, performing ceremonies that lasted through the night, chanting in languages no Christian soul should know. She paused, and in that pause, somewhere in the building above us, a floorboard creaked with the particular sound of weight being deliberately placed, then withdrawn. We all heard it, that small intrusion of sound into the narrative's flow, and Mrs. Blackwood's expression shifted to something approaching relief, as though the interruption provided excuse to retreat from dangerous waters. "Forgive me," she said quickly, gathering the plates once more. "I should not speak of such things. Old tales, nothing more. The imaginings of simpler times, when folk saw portents in every unusual occurrence. You must be weary from your journey. Perhaps you would care for tea in your rooms before retiring." Holmes made no move to detain her further, recognizing that the moment for revelation had passed, sealed off by whatever presence had made itself known through that single creaking board above our heads. "Tea would be most welcome, Mrs. Blackwood. You are very kind." After she had withdrawn, moving quickly through the door that led to the kitchen regions, Holmes sat back in his chair and regarded the fire with an expression of deep thought. Miss Ashworth, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "She is afraid," she said quietly, "genuinely, profoundly afraid, not merely of old stories, but of present danger." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And that sound from above, did you mark its deliberateness? Someone wished us to know they were listening, wished Mrs. Blackwood to know that her words were being monitored. A warning, elegantly delivered through the simple medium of a creaking board." He rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain to peer out into the darkness. "The observatory is visible from here, though barely. A faint light shows in one of the lower windows. Either Professor Ashworth has returned, or someone else has taken up residence in his absence." I joined him at the window, following his gaze toward that distant structure, perched on its elevated position above the village. The light he had noted was indeed visible, a small point of illumination that seemed to pulse slightly, though whether from the unsteady quality of a flame or from some atmospheric disturbance, I could not determine. Around us, the village lay in darkness, broken only by the occasional window's glow. The houses huddled together, as though seeking mutual protection against the vast emptiness of the moors that pressed in from all sides. We should investigate tonight, I suggested, though even as I spoke, I felt a curious reluctance, an instinctive resistance to venturing out into that watching darkness. Holmes shook his head slowly. Tomorrow will serve. Whatever presence occupies the observatory tonight will not vanish by morning, and I suspect we will be more welcome, or at least less unexpected, if we approach in daylight. Besides, he added with a slight smile, Mrs. Blackwood has promised us tea, and it would be discourteous to vanish before receiving such hospitality. The tea arrived some minutes later, brought by Mrs. Blackwood herself, her composure now fully restored, though her eyes still carried that shadow of worry we had glimpsed earlier. She wished us a peaceful night, with emphasis that suggested such peace was not guaranteed, then withdrew to her own quarters, leaving us alone in the common room with only the fire for company and the wind's increasing voice outside. We retired eventually to our respective rooms, though I found sleep elusive despite the comfort of the bed and the warmth provided by a small fire that had been laid in the grate. Through the thin walls, I could hear the old building settling around me, its ancient timbers contracting in the night's chill, creating a symphony of creaks and sighs that might have been merely structural complaint, or might have been the passage of unseen occupants through darkened corridors. My window looked out across the rooftops toward the observatory, and twice I rose to peer through the glass, finding each time that the light I had seen earlier still burned, constant and enigmatic in the darkness. Sleep came eventually, as it always does, pulling me down into dreams that mix the day's images with older memories. Gaslit London streets transforming into moorland paths, the sound of train wheels becoming the rhythm of hoofbeats, and always, hanging in the sky of these dream landscapes, a star that burned with unwholesome crimson light. Neither quite natural nor entirely alien, but something suspended between categories, watching with what felt distinctly like malevolent intelligence. I woke to grey dawn light filtering through my window and the sound of activity in the inn below, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, voices speaking in low tones, the smell of bread baking and bacon frying. The observatory was just visible through morning mist that had rolled in from the moors, its dome ghostly and indistinct, the light in its window now extinguished. I washed and dressed quickly, finding Holmes already downstairs in the common room, seated at the same table we had occupied the previous evening, a cup of tea cooling before him, while he studied a map he had spread across the weathered wood. "Good morning, Watson," he said, without looking up from his examination. "I trust you slept well, despite our surroundings' rather oppressive atmosphere." "Well enough," I replied, joining him and accepting the tea Mrs. Blackwood poured for me from a pot she had brought over, her movements quick and efficient in the morning light. "I see you have been studying the local geography." "Indeed. This map was provided by our hostess, though with considerable reluctance. Observe." He traced a long finger across the paper, indicating a location to the east of the village. The observatory sits here, on what is marked as Ashworth Ridge, though I suspect that name is recent, and the location held other designations in earlier times. And here, his finger moved to a point perhaps 2 miles north of the observatory. Crimson Fell, site of the stone circle Mrs. Blackwood mentioned. The name itself is suggestive, is it not? Either the fell was named for the star's appearances, or the star earned its sobriquet from the location. Either way, the connection seems clear. Miss Ashworth descended the stairs at that moment, dressed for outdoor walking in a practical woolen dress and sturdy boots, her dark hair arranged in a simple style that suggested she had anticipated the day's probable activities. Her face showed signs of sleeplessness, but her bearing remained composed, determined. "Gentlemen," she greeted us, "I assume we shall visit the observatory this morning?" "After breakfast," Holmes confirmed. "One investigates mysteries more effectively on a full stomach, I have found. Besides, I wish to observe the village in daylight, to take note of who stirs early and who keeps to their houses, to mark the patterns of normal life against which any abnormality will show in sharp relief." The meal was substantial. Eggs and bacon, thick slices of toasted bread spread with local butter and preserves, strong black tea that cleared the remnants of sleep from the mind. Through the window, I watched Thornfield Cross come to life in its subdued fashion. A few early risers moving about their business, a cart pulling away from what appeared to be a baker's shop, chickens scratching in a yard across the way. It seemed painfully ordinary, this village morning. And yet, beneath that ordinariness lay something else, a current of tension that was almost palpable, as though everyone moved through carefully choreographed routines designed to avoid notice, to present normalcy while concealing deeper truths. We set out shortly after 9 o'clock, the three of us walking together through the village and out onto the path that led eastward toward the ridge where the observatory stood. The morning air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of heather and damp earth, and overhead the sky showed patches of pale blue between racing grey clouds. The moors stretched away on either side of our path, their expanse both magnificent and somehow oppressive, that sense of vast emptiness that could make one feel simultaneously liberated and vulnerable. The path rose steadily before us, winding between outcroppings of dark stone that emerged from the moorland like the vertebrae of some ancient creature, half buried and forgotten by time. Our footsteps made little sound on the hard-packed earth, and conversation fell away naturally in the face of the landscape's immensity, each of us lost in private contemplation as we climbed. I found my physician's eye noting the way Miss Ashworth's breathing remained steady despite the incline, her months of worry apparently not having diminished her physical resilience, while Holmes moved with that peculiar efficiency of motion that characterized all his actions, wasting neither energy nor attention on anything extraneous to his purpose. The observatory grew larger as we approached, resolving itself from ghostly outline into solid structure. A building perhaps 30 feet in diameter, its lower portion constructed of the same grey stone as the village below. Its upper hemisphere composed of white-painted wood panels, arranged in sections that could be rotated to open the telescope to whatever portion of sky required observation. A smaller building stood adjacent to it, presumably living quarters or a workshop, its single chimney cold and smokeless in the morning air. The entire complex possessed an air of abandonment that went beyond mere emptiness, as though the buildings themselves had withdrawn from human occupation, had begun the slow process of returning to the moorland from which they had been carved. Holmes paused at the low stone wall that marked the observatory's boundary, his sharp gaze sweeping across the scene, with that methodical attention to detail that could transform chaos into legible narrative. "The gate stands open," he observed quietly, indicating the iron structure that hung slightly askew on its hinges. "Not forced, but left deliberately unfastened. See how the rust has begun to accumulate on the lower hinge. This has been open for some time, perhaps weeks, and the path beyond shows signs of regular traffic, despite the professor's apparent absence. Someone has been visiting this place with considerable frequency." We moved through the gate and approached the main observatory building, our feet crunching now on gravel that had been laid around the structure's foundation. The door to the living quarters proved to be unlocked, opening with a soft groan of hinges that echoed in the morning stillness. Miss Ashworth entered first, her right to do so unquestioned given her relationship to the missing professor, and we followed her into a space that spoke volumes about its former occupant's character and habits. The room we entered served as both study and living area, its stone walls lined with bookcases that sagged under the weight of volumes, both astronomical and philosophical. A desk dominated one corner, its surface invisible beneath layers of papers, notebooks, and scattered writing implements. A cold fireplace occupied the opposite wall, its grate filled with ashes that had not been disturbed in many days. The air held the particular staleness of enclosed spaces, long unventilated, mixed with the ghost of pipe tobacco and something else. A faint metallic scent that I could not immediately identify, but that raised the hairs on the back of my neck with its subtle wrongness. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, his hands hovering over the scattered papers without touching them, his eyes darting from one item to another with rapidity that suggested he was reading not individual documents, but rather the entire scene as a unified text. "Miss Ashworth," he said without looking up, "was your uncle left-handed or right-handed?" "Right-handed," she replied, standing in the centre of the room as though uncertain where to begin her own examination. "Why do you ask?" "Because these papers have been disturbed by someone who is left-handed. Observe the pattern of displacement. Items shifted consistently from right to left, rather than the reverse, suggesting a hand reaching across from the left side to examine documents that would naturally lie to the right for a right-handed person working at this desk. Someone has searched through your uncle's notes, Miss Ashworth, and recently enough that no dust has settled on the disturbed areas." He bent closer to the desk's surface, and I saw his expression shift to something approaching excitement, that particular intensity that indicated a significant discovery. With careful fingers, he lifted a single sheet of paper, holding it toward the grey light that filtered through the room's small window. "Watson, your medical eye, if you please. What make you of this stain?" I moved to his side and examined the paper he held. It was covered in what appeared to be astronomical calculations, numbers and symbols marching in neat columns. But in one corner was a dark stain, brown-red and irregular in shape. I had seen enough blood in my time to recognize it immediately, despite its dried state. "Blood," I confirmed. "Several days old at least, possibly longer. Not a large quantity, perhaps from a cut finger or small wound, but definitely human blood. A sound from above made us all freeze, a distinct scraping noise, as of something heavy being dragged across the floor of the observatory dome itself. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then ceased, leaving silence that seemed somehow more pronounced than the sound had been. Holmes's eyes lifted to the ceiling, his body tensed for action, yet remaining perfectly still, listening with every fibre of his being. When no further sound came, he moved swiftly toward the narrow staircase that spiraled upward from the corner of the room, its iron steps disappearing into darkness above. "Stay here," he instructed quietly, though I had already retrieved my service revolver from my coat pocket, a precaution I had taken before leaving the inn that morning. Holmes noted the weapon with a slight nod of approval, then began to ascend, his footsteps careful and deliberate on the metal treads, each placement calculated to minimize sound. I followed close behind, with Miss Ashworth maintaining position at the stairs' base, despite what I could see was a strong desire to accompany us. The dome's interior opened around us as we emerged from the staircase, a circular space perhaps 25 feet across, its curved walls painted white to maximize reflected light during nighttime observations. The telescope dominated the center, a magnificent brass and iron instrument mounted on a complex mechanism that allowed for precise positioning, its tube perhaps 12 feet in length and pointing currently toward the eastern horizon. But it was not the telescope that captured our immediate attention. The floor around the instrument was covered in a peculiar pattern, symbols drawn in what appeared to be red chalk, forming a complex geometric design that radiated outward from the telescope's base like the petals of some mathematical flower. Each symbol was precise and deliberate, combining astronomical notations with characters I did not recognize, possibly from languages older than any currently spoken. At 5 points around the circle's circumference stood small brass bowls, their interiors stained dark with residue of something burned, the smell of which still lingered faintly in the air. Incense, perhaps, mixed with herbs whose purpose I could only guess at. Holmes stood perfectly still, taking in the scene with an expression that combined fascination with something approaching dread. "The cult of the Crimson Star," he said softly, as though naming the thing gave it power, made it real in a way that observation alone could not. Not merely legend or the professor's paranoid imaginings, but something actual and active. This is a ritual space, Watson, consecrated to purposes that merge ancient practice with modern astronomical knowledge. Someone has been using the professor's own instruments, his own observatory, to conduct ceremonies devoted to... He paused, moving closer to examine one of the brass bowls, to calling something, or perhaps to marking its arrival. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold seeping through the dome's partially opened panels. The scraping sound we had heard, had it been the wind disturbing these ritual implements, or had we interrupted someone in the very act of their mysterious devotions? The thought that we might not be alone in this place, that someone might even now be watching from concealment, made my grip tighten on the revolver's handle. Holmes had moved to the telescope itself, examining its position with careful attention. "It is pointed toward a specific coordinate," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Not merely toward the eastern horizon, but toward a precise location in the sky. And here," he indicated a notebook that lay open on a small table beside the telescope, its pages filled with observations, in what must have been Professor Ashworth's hand. The last entry is dated 3 weeks ago, the night before he sent the urgent letter to Miss Ashworth. Listen to this. The convergence is undeniable. 3 points of crimson light now visible, forming a triangle with apex pointing toward Polaris. The ancient texts were accurate. The star does not appear alone, but announces itself through heralds, through preparatory manifestations that build in intensity and frequency. They will come on the new moon as they came before. The circle must be warned, though I fear they will not believe, will dismiss my findings as the ravings of an isolated mind. But I have seen the pattern. I have calculated the position. In 7 days, the crimson star will be visible from this exact location, and with it will come those who have waited centuries for its return. The words hung in the air between us, their implications vast and disturbing. Holmes closed the notebook carefully, his expression thoughtful. 7 days from the date of this entry would have been, he calculated quickly, 16 days ago, the night of the new moon that has just passed, the very night, Miss Ashworth, that you received your uncle's final letter. Holmes's words settled over us like frost, transforming speculation into something approaching certainty, and I found myself looking again at the ritual circle drawn upon the floor, its symbols seeming to pulse with meaning just beyond my comprehension. Miss Ashworth had joined us now, Ion. Miss Ashworth had joined us now, ascending the stairs despite Holmes's earlier instruction, and she stood gazing down at the geometric pattern with an expression that mingled grief with a kind of terrible understanding, as though pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling had suddenly locked into place with undeniable clarity. He knew, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft whistle of wind through the dome's partially opened panels. He understood what was coming and tried to warn me, tried to warn someone, anyone who might listen, and instead of finding help, he found. She gestured helplessly at the ritual circle, at the evidence of intrusion and desecration. They came here. They used his own sacred space, his temple to scientific inquiry, and perverted it into something else entirely. I moved to the telescope, careful not to disturb the chalked symbols on the floor, and peered through its eyepiece, though the morning sky offered little to observe beyond the racing clouds. The instrument was exquisitely crafted, its brass fittings polished to a mirror gleam despite weeks of apparent abandonment, and through its lens I could see a small portion of sky magnified to stunning clarity, each detail of cloud formation rendered with perfect precision. It seemed somehow obscene that such an instrument of enlightenment should have been conscripted into rituals aimed at purposes I could only dimly imagine. Holmes had knelt beside one of the brass bowls, producing a small magnifying glass from his pocket, and examining the residue within with minute attention. Frankincense, he murmured, combined with something else. Wormwood, I think, and possibly mandrake root. Herbs associated with visions and altered states of consciousness, used since ancient times in ceremonies designed to pierce the veil between seen and unseen worlds. Whoever conducted these rituals was following very old recipes indeed, traditions that predate Christianity by centuries, perhaps millennia. He rose and moved to the dome's edge, where the panels opened to reveal the moorland, stretching away beneath us in all directions. From this elevation, the view was remarkable. The village of Thornfield Cross, visible as a cluster of grey buildings to the west, and to the north, perhaps 2 miles distant, a formation of standing stones arranged in a circle on what must be the summit of Crimson Fell. Even from this distance, the stones possessed a presence, their dark forms upright against the sky, like fingers reaching toward heaven, or perhaps like the bars of a cage designed to contain something that should not be released. "There," Holmes said, pointing toward the stone circle. "That is where we must go next. Whatever began here in this observatory found its culmination there, in that ancient place where earth and sky meet, where our ancestors worshipped powers they could not name but somehow understood." The professor's notes speak of the circle being warned. I believe he meant that stone circle, not some metaphorical gathering of scholars. There is a connection between these two places, between ancient ritual site and modern scientific observatory, a connection the cult has recognized and exploited. A sudden gust of wind caught one of the dome's panels, slamming it shut with a bang that echoed through the circular chamber like a gunshot, making us all start with nerves already stretched taut by the morning's discoveries. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Distant voices, carried on the wind from somewhere below, growing gradually closer. Holmes heard them too, his expression sharpening as he moved swiftly to the staircase. "Someone approaches," he said quietly. "Perhaps our morning visitor, returning to complete interrupted business. Watson, your revolver at the ready, but concealed. Miss Ashworth, please remain here and out of sight until we determine who our guests might be." We descended the spiral stairs rapidly but quietly, emerging into the study just as the sound of footsteps on gravel reached us from outside. Through the window, I could see 2 figures approaching. Men, both dressed in the rough clothing of moorland farmers or labourers, their faces weathered by exposure to wind and sun. They moved with purpose, but without apparent stealth, suggesting they had legitimate business, or at least believed themselves to have it. Holmes positioned himself behind the door, gesturing for me to remain visible but appear casual, occupied with examining the bookshelves as any visitor might be. The door opened without preamble, the first man entering with the confidence of one who has every right to be there. He was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and raw-boned, with dark hair shot through with grey, and eyes the colour of slate that took in my presence with immediate suspicion. His companion followed, shorter but more powerfully built, his hands showing the calluses and scars of manual labour. Both men froze upon seeing me, their expressions shifting through surprise toward something approaching hostility. "Who are you?" the taller man demanded, his accent thick with the local burr, his hand moving unconsciously toward his belt, where I glimpsed the handle of a knife sheathed there. "This is private property, Professor's property. You've no right to be here." I maintained a posture of calm inquiry, setting down the book I had been pretending to examine. "I am Dr. John Watson, and I am here at the invitation of Miss Cordelia Ashworth, the Professor's niece. Perhaps you gentlemen can tell me where I might find Professor Ashworth. Miss Ashworth is quite concerned about his welfare." The 2 men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them, and I saw the first man's jaw tighten as though in internal debate. "The Professor's gone," he said finally, his tone suggesting finality, rather than simple absence. "Left 3 weeks past, said he had business in Edinburgh, didn't say when he'd return." It was a lie, transparently constructed and delivered without conviction, and I wondered whether the men themselves believed it or simply repeated a story they had been instructed to tell. Before I could respond, Holmes stepped from behind the door with movements so fluid they seemed almost gentle, though his presence filled the room with sudden authority. "Curious," Holmes said mildly, his hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic pose of contemplation. Because the professor's last letter to his niece, written 3 weeks ago, made no mention of Edinburgh, but rather spoke of immediate danger and a cult that wished him harm. "Tell me, gentlemen, do either of you belong to this cult of the Crimson Star, or do you merely clean up after their ceremonies?" The effect of his words was immediate and profound. The shorter man actually took a step backward, his face draining of colour, while his companion's hand moved fully to his knife handle now, though he did not yet draw the weapon. "You should leave Thornfield Cross," the taller man said, his voice low and carrying an edge of genuine warning rather than mere threat. "You should leave today and take Miss Ashworth with you. There are matters here that don't concern outsiders, matters that go back further than you can imagine, and those who interfere." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Those who interfere tend to disappear, like the professor did. We're trying to help you, see? Trying to warn you proper-like, before it's too late for warnings." Holmes regarded them with an expression of polite interest, as though they were discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackthorne," the man supplied reluctantly. "Tom Blackthorne, and this is Will Stokes. We work the land hereabouts, have done for generations. We know the moors, know what lives in the old places, what sleeps in the earth, and watches from the sky." The professor thought he could understand it through his telescopes and his numbers. But some things can't be measured and calculated. Some things just are, and have always been, and will be long after we're dust. The silence that followed Blackthorne's words stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken implications, and I found myself acutely aware of the weight of my revolver in my pocket, though I hoped profoundly that its use would prove unnecessary. Holmes remained perfectly still, his grey eyes fixed on Blackthorne, with that penetrating gaze that seemed to read not merely surface expressions, but the deeper currents of thought and emotion that moved beneath them. Outside, a raven called from somewhere on the moors, its harsh cry carrying across the empty landscape like a fragment of ancient prophecy. "What you describe, Mr. Blackthorne," Holmes said at length, his voice maintaining its tone of mild inquiry despite the tension crackling through the room, "sounds remarkably like a threat wrapped in the clothing of friendly advice. I wonder whether you speak from personal conviction, or whether you merely relay warnings you have been instructed to deliver. The distinction matters, you understand, because one suggests genuine concern, while the other implies complicity in whatever has befallen Professor Ashworth." Blackthorne's jaw worked as though chewing on words he wished to speak but dared not release, and his companion, Stokes, shifted his weight nervously, his eyes darting toward the door, as though calculating the possibility of retreat. It was Stokes who broke first, his voice rough with emotion that might have been fear or might have been something closer to anguish. "We liked the professor," he said suddenly. "He was a good man, always civil, always interested in our talk about the old ways, the old stories our grandmothers told. He didn't mock, like most educated folk do. He listened. And when he started seeing things in the sky, started marking patterns, he came to us, asked us what we knew about the Crimson Star, about the old circle on the fell. And what did you tell him? Holmes asked gently, sensing perhaps that Stokes represented a crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded the professor's disappearance. Stokes glanced at Blackthorne, who gave the slightest shake of his head. But the shorter man seemed to have passed some internal threshold, beyond which fear of immediate companions mattered less than the weight of conscience. We told him what we knew, he continued, his words coming faster now, as though released under pressure. That the stone circle was raised in times beyond memory, by people who watched the sky and knew things we've forgotten. That every so often, generations apart, sometimes centuries, the Crimson Star appears, and when it does, certain folk gather, folk who've kept the old knowledge alive in secret, waiting for the sign. They say it's a door opening, Mr. Holmes, a door between here and somewhere else, and those who know the proper rituals can step through, or bring through things that should stay on the other side. A cup that had been sitting precariously on the edge of the desk chose this moment to fall, striking the floor with a sharp crack that made us all jump, the sound disproportionately loud in the charged atmosphere. It did not shatter completely, but broke cleanly in half, and I found myself staring at it, this small domestic casualty of our tense confrontation, its broken edges catching the grey morning light that filtered through the window. Holmes moved to pick up the pieces, his movements deliberate and calm, as though the broken cup were a clue of equal importance to anything else in the room. He examined the fragments, then set them carefully on the desk before returning his attention to our visitors. Continue, Mr. Stokes. You told the professor about the door. What happened then? He wanted to see the circle, Blackthorne interjected, his voice heavy with resignation, as though recognizing that the story would be told regardless of his preferences. We tried to dissuade him, but he was determined, said he needed to examine the stones, to take measurements and see if they aligned with the positions he'd calculated. So we took him, Will and I, because better we go with him than he go alone and unprepared. This was about a month back, just after the first red light appeared. Not the star itself, but one of its heralds, as he called them. The two men seemed to relax slightly now that the story had begun, as though the act of speaking released pressure that had been building within them. Blackthorne moved to lean against the wall, his hand falling away from his knife, while Stokes found a chair and settled into it with a sigh that spoke of weariness that went beyond the physical. The stones stand in a perfect circle, Blackthorne continued, his voice taking on a quality almost like that of a storyteller settling into a familiar tale. 12 of them, each about 8 feet high, grey granite that's weathered smooth over the ages. The professor brought his instruments, his measuring devices and notebooks, and he spent hours examining everything. The spacing between stones, their alignment with the horizon, symbols carved into their bases that most folk never notice because they're half buried in earth and covered with moss. He grew very excited, very agitated, kept muttering about mathematical precision and astronomical significance. And then night fell, Stokes added quietly. We'd meant to leave before dark, but the professor lost track of time, and suddenly the sun was setting, and we were still on the fell. We should have left anyway, should have insisted, but the professor wanted to see the circle under stars. wanted to observe the red lights from that location. So we stayed. A shudder passed through Stokes as he spoke, and I saw his hands grip the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. They came just after midnight. We saw their torches first, moving up the path from the north, perhaps 20 people, all dressed in robes the colour of dried blood. They formed a circle around the stones, and they began to chant in a language I'd never heard, words that seemed to twist in the air like living things. The professor wanted to approach them, to ask them about their ceremony, but we held him back, thank God, because when the chanting reached its peak, when the red lights in the sky seemed to pulse in rhythm with the words, he paused, swallowing hard. The space inside the stone circle changed, Mr. Holmes. The air went thick and dark, like looking through smoked glass, and through that darkness we saw things, shapes that weren't quite right, geometries that hurt to look at, as though the world had folded in on itself in ways that shouldn't be possible. Holmes had gone very still, his entire being focused on Stokes's words with an intensity that suggested he was not merely listening, but somehow experiencing the scene described, his remarkable imagination reconstructing events from the raw material of testimony. I found my own breath had quickened, despite every rational instinct to dismiss such descriptions as the product of overwrought nerves, or suggestible minds predisposed to see the supernatural in natural phenomena. What happened to Professor Ashworth? Holmes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackthorne and Stokes exchanged another glance, and this time what passed between them was unmistakable. Shared guilt, shared knowledge of something terrible. He went back, Blackthorne said finally. 3 days later, he went back to the circle alone. We tried to stop him, tried to make him understand the danger, but he said he had to know, had to understand what he'd seen. He said he'd worked out the timing, knew when the next ceremony would occur, and he wanted to witness it properly, to document it with his scientific instruments. That was 3 weeks ago, the night of the new moon. We haven't seen him since. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a small clock on the mantelpiece, a sound I had not consciously noticed before, but which now seemed impossibly loud, marking seconds that accumulated into minutes, into hours, into the days of absence that had transformed concern into certainty of loss. Through the window, I could see the stone circle on Crimson Fell, its dark forms just visible against the grey sky, and I felt a profound reluctance to imagine what the professor might have encountered there, alone in darkness, when the cult gathered for their mysterious purposes. Miss Ashworth's voice came from the stairway where she had been standing throughout this exchange, her presence forgotten by all of us in the intensity of the men's testimony. "You left him," she said, her words carrying neither accusation nor grief, but simple, terrible comprehension. "You knew he intended to go back, knew the danger he faced, and you did nothing to prevent it, nothing to protect him, or to raise alarm when he failed to return." Blackthorne's face contorted with something that looked like shame, wrestling with self-preservation, the emotions playing across his weathered features in the grey morning light that filled the professor's study. He opened his mouth as if to speak, closed it again, then finally found Dak, closed it again, then finally found words that emerged rough and halting, scraped from some deep reservoir of remorse. "You don't understand, miss," he said, his earlier hostility dissolving into naked vulnerability. It's not about courage or cowardice, not in the way you might think. There are rules here, old rules, that govern what can and cannot be done, what can and cannot be spoken. Those who break them, he gestured helplessly, a motion that encompassed the empty observatory, the abandoned study, the professor's conspicuous absence. Your uncle broke them, Miss Ashworth. He saw what shouldn't be seen, understood what's meant to remain mysterious. And the circle, not the stone circle, but the human circle, the cult, they decided he'd become a danger to their secrets. Miss Ashworth descended the remaining stairs with measured steps, her composure maintained through visible effort, and I saw in her, bearing the same quality I had observed in soldiers facing overwhelming odds, a determination to meet catastrophe with dignity intact, to refuse the luxury of collapse, even when collapse would be entirely justified. She stood before Blackthorne and Stokes, smaller than either man, but somehow commanding the space through sheer force of contained emotion. "Then help me now," she said, quietly, each word precisely placed. "Help me understand what happened to my uncle, where he might be found, whether he yet lives, or whether I must accept the worst. You speak of rules and secrets, of cults and ceremonies, but I speak of a man who showed you kindness, who listened to your stories and respected your traditions. Surely that kinship deserves something more than silence and evasion." Stokes rose from his chair, his stocky frame seeming to carry immense weight as he moved to stand before Miss Ashworth. "He's gone, miss," he said, his voice thick with emotion that might have been grief, or might have been guilt, or perhaps both intertwined. "Gone to where the ceremonies send those who witness without permission, those who try to understand the door's mechanics rather than accept its mystery. Whether that means dead in some ordinary sense, or lost in ways that defy ordinary understanding, I cannot say with certainty. But the man who went to Crimson Fell 3 weeks ago did not return, and I think—" He paused, struggling with the formulation. "I think whatever came through the door that night took something back with it when it retreated, took your uncle, or took his essence, or perhaps invited him through to the other side. The red lights faded after that ceremony, you see. The heralds disappeared, the pattern in the sky dissolved, as though something had been completed, some transaction fulfilled. Holmes, who had remained silent during this exchange, now stepped forward with an expression that combined sympathy with relentless determination. "This cult," he said, "they must have a leader, someone who directs the ceremonies and interprets the astronomical signs. Someone, perhaps, who lives in Thornfield Cross itself and maintains the appearance of ordinary village life while secretly orchestrating these gatherings on Crimson Fell. Who is it, Mr. Blackthorne, who leads the cult of the Crimson Star?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread, and I saw both men physically recoil from it, as though the mere asking constituted a violation of some fundamental prohibition. Blackthorne's hand moved again toward his knife, not threateningly now, but as though seeking the comfort of a familiar object in the face of overwhelming pressure. Outside, the wind had risen further, and I heard it moaning across the moorland, with a voice that sounded almost human, almost articulate, as though the landscape itself participated in the drama unfolding within these stone walls. "There are things," Blackthorne said slowly, "that speaking aloud gives power to. Names that, when pronounced, create connections between speaker and named. You ask us to utter words that would mark us, that would identify us as betrayers of trusts, older than the village, older, perhaps, than Christianity itself. Would you ask that of us, Mr. Holmes? Would you condemn us to whatever fate befalls those who violate the deepest oaths? A sudden crack from above made us all freeze. Not the earlier scraping sound, but something sharper, more definitive, like wood splintering under stress. Holmes's eyes darted to the ceiling, then to the stairway, and without a word, he moved swiftly toward the spiral steps, taking them 2 at a time, despite their narrow construction. I followed immediately, my hand once again finding the revolver's grip, while Miss Ashworth and the 2 local men remained below, their confrontation suspended by this new development. The observatory dome was as we had left it, the ritual circle still inscribed on the floor, the brass bowls still positioned at their cardinal points. But now, one of the wall panels had partially collapsed inward, its wooden frame fractured along lines that suggested not age or weather, but deliberate force applied from outside. Through the opening, cold wind poured into the circular chamber, carrying with it moisture from clouds that had descended lower, beginning to envelop the ridge in grey embrace. Holmes moved to the breach, examining the broken wood with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This damage is fresh," he murmured, running his fingers along the splintered edges. "Within the hour, I would estimate. Someone has been watching us, Watson, watching and waiting for an opportune moment to create this distraction, to draw our attention upward, while—" He whirled suddenly, his gaze sweeping the dome's interior with renewed intensity. "The telescope. Look at the telescope." I turned to examine the great brass instrument, and immediately saw what had caught Holmes's attention. The telescope's position had changed, subtly but unmistakably, to an eye trained in observation. Where before it had pointed toward the eastern horizon, it now aimed at a steeper angle, directed toward a portion of sky that would be invisible during daylight hours, but which would, after sunset, reveal whatever celestial mysteries occupied that particular coordinate. And beside the instrument, where Professor Ashworth's notebook had lain open, there now rested a different volume, bound in leather so dark it appeared almost black, its pages thick with age and covered in handwriting that seemed to shift and waver in the uncertain light. Holmes approached the book with the caution one might reserve for a venomous serpent, and indeed there was something almost threatening about the volume's presence, as though it radiated a field of wrongness that made the air around it feel heavier, more resistant to breath. He opened it carefully, supporting the ancient binding with both hands, and I saw his eyes widen fractionally as he read the first page, his lips moving slightly, as though sounding out words in a language unfamiliar, yet somehow accessible to his polyglot mind. "Watson," he said, without looking up from the page, his voice carrying a quality I had rarely heard from him, something approaching awe mixed with apprehension. "This appears to be a grimoire, a book of magical ritual and astronomical observation, combined in ways that suggest their authors saw no distinction between the two disciplines. The text is primarily in Latin, but with passages in what I believe to be much older tongues, possibly Sumerian, possibly something even more ancient. It details the appearances of the Crimson Star throughout recorded history, each manifestation marked by specific celestial configurations and accompanied by ceremonies designed to He paused, his finger tracing lines of text, to facilitate communication, or perhaps communion, between our world and whatever realm the star represents or connects to. He turned pages carefully, his attention completely absorbed by the volume's contents, and I found myself dividing my focus between watching him and monitoring the broken panel, half expecting someone to appear there, to reveal themselves as the author of this latest intrusion. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by wind and the soft rustle of ancient pages, until Holmes closed the book with a gentleness that spoke of recognition of its value, whether scholarly or sinister. "This volume," he said, "was left here deliberately, placed where we would find it after being drawn to the dome by the sound of the panel breaking. Someone wants us to read this, wants us to understand the cult's purposes and the star's significance. The question is whether this constitutes a genuine attempt to enlighten us, or whether it represents a more subtle form of misdirection, drawing our attention toward mystical explanations, while more prosaic truths remain hidden." We carried the grimoire down to the study, Holmes cradling it against his chest, as though it was something precious and dangerous in equal measure, his movements careful on the spiral stairs that seemed narrower somehow during our descent, as though the building itself were contracting around us in response to the volume's presence. Blackthorne and Stokes had remained below with Miss Ashworth, and when we emerged with the ancient book, I saw recognition flash across both men's faces. Not surprise, but rather a kind of resigned confirmation, as though they had been waiting for this particular revelation to manifest itself. "You've seen this before," Holmes stated, setting the grimoire on the desk with deliberate care, its dark leather cover seeming to absorb the grey light rather than reflect it. "This is the cult's sacred text, their manual of ritual and cosmic understanding. Where is it normally kept, and who has authority to move it from its resting place?" Blackthorne's resistance had crumbled entirely now, replaced by the exhaustion of someone who has carried secrets too heavy for too long, and finds relief in their dispersal, regardless of consequences. He moved closer to the desk, though I noticed he did not touch the book, maintaining a respectful or perhaps fearful distance from its physical presence. "It's kept in the church," he said quietly, "in a hidden chamber beneath the altar, accessible only to the keeper of the mysteries, the one who reads the stars and interprets the signs. Father Whitmore, though he's more than a simple priest, has been for generations of Whitmores before him. They were keepers when this was still a pagan place, before Christianity came and wrapped itself around the older practices like ivy over stone, changing the names, but not the essential nature of what was worshipped. The names settled over the room like snow falling, transforming the landscape of our understanding. Father Whitmore, I recalled glimpsing the church as we walked through the village, its Norman tower solid and reassuring, a symbol of established faith and moral authority. That such a figure might simultaneously serve as leader of a cult devoted to cosmic mysteries and possibly celestial entities seemed almost impossible. Yet, I had learned through my association with Holmes that respectability and darkness often dwelt in the same vessel, that the most sinister secrets frequently hid behind the most conventional facades. Father Whitmore brought the professor into the cult's inner circle, Stokes added, his voice carrying the tone of someone confessing to crimes witnessed rather than committed. After that first night at the stone circle, after the professor had seen the ceremony and the things that appeared in the darkness between the stones. The father came to him, came here to this very room, and explained that what the professor had witnessed was not madness or hallucination, but reality perceived in its deeper dimensions. He offered the professor a choice: join the cult, learn its mysteries properly under guidance, or face the consequences of unsanctioned knowledge. Miss Ashworth had been listening with an expression of such focused intensity that her features seemed carved from the same stone as the walls around us. Now she spoke, her voice steady, despite what must have been tremendous internal turmoil. My uncle would never have joined such a cult willingly, never have participated in ceremonies that contradicted his scientific principles and rational worldview. He was a man of enlightenment, of reason, of empirical observation. Was he? Holmes asked gently, opening the grimoire to a page he had marked with a finger during our examination above. Because according to this text, someone with intimate knowledge of astronomical observation has been adding contemporary notes to margins that date back centuries. Look here. He turned the book so Miss Ashworth could see, though he kept his hand protectively on its cover. These annotations are recent, within the past year certainly, and they detail observations of the red lights your uncle mentioned in his letters, complete with precise coordinates and timing calculations. The handwriting. He paused delicately. I would need samples for absolute confirmation, but it bears strong resemblance to the hand that wrote the notes scattered on this desk. The implication hung between us, unwelcome but undeniable, that Professor Ashworth had not merely stumbled into the cult's mysteries, but had engaged with them, studied them, perhaps even contributed to their understanding. Miss Ashworth's composure wavered for the first time since entering the observatory, her hand reaching out to grip the desk's edge for support. Outside, the mist had thickened into something approaching genuine fog, erasing the landscape beyond the windows, and leaving us suspended in grey emptiness, isolated from the wider world by veils of moisture that seemed almost deliberately placed. Holmes closed the grimoire and fixed Blackthorne with a gaze that demanded absolute honesty. What happened during the ceremony 3 weeks ago, on the night of the new moon? You said the professor returned to the stone circle alone, but someone must have witnessed what transpired. The cult was there, performing their rituals. What did they see? Blackthorne shifted his weight, his eyes moving to the window, as though seeking escape through the obscuring fog. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, selected with obvious care. I wasn't there myself, he admitted. I'd done my part, tried to warn him off, and when he insisted on going anyway, I washed my hands of it. But Will here. He glanced at his companion. Will's brother is in the cult, has been for years. He told Will what he saw, swore him to secrecy, but I reckon secrets don't matter much now. Not with Mr. Holmes poking about and asking questions that'll get answered one way or another. All eyes turned to Stokes, who seemed to shrink under the weight of attention, his stocky frame hunching as though trying to minimize its presence in the room. A log in the cold fireplace chose this moment to settle, its movement sending up a small cloud of ash that drifted through the still air like grey snow, and the sound seemed to break some internal dam within Stokes, releasing words that flowed with the urgency of long-suppressed testimony. My brother Michael, he began. He told me the professor arrived at the stone circle just as the cult was gathering, just as Father Whitmore was beginning the opening invocations. The professor had brought his instruments, telescope, notebooks, measuring devices, and he positioned himself outside the circle of stones, in the darkness beyond the torchlight, as though he meant to observe without participating. But Father Whitmore knew he was there, acknowledged his presence with a nod, almost as if the professor's attendance had been expected, perhaps even invited. Stokes paused, and I saw him swallow hard, his hands gripping each other with such force that his knuckles had gone white. The ceremony proceeded as Michael had seen it before, the chanting in old languages, the burning of herbs in the brass bowls, the participants moving in patterns that matched the positions of stars overhead. But this time, according to Michael, there was a difference. The red lights in the sky, the heralds as the professor called them, they pulsed with unusual intensity, and the space inside the stone circle began to change more dramatically than in previous ceremonies. The air went dark, as I described earlier, but within that darkness appeared what Michael described as a doorway. Not a physical door, but an opening, a rent in the fabric of reality itself, showing through to somewhere else. He paused again, his breathing laboured, and Miss Ashworth made a small sound of distress that she immediately suppressed, her hand pressed to her mouth, as though to prevent further betrayals of emotion. Holmes remained perfectly still, his entire focus on Stokes, encouraging continuation through attention rather than interruption. "The professor," Stokes continued. "He couldn't help himself," Michael said. "He moved forward, drawn toward the opening like a moth toward flame, his scientific instruments forgotten, his notebooks dropped in the heather. He walked right into the stone circle, into the midst of the ceremony, and he reached out his hand toward the darkness, toward whatever lay beyond the doorway. And Father Whitmore, instead of stopping him, instead of pulling him back, spoke words that Michael didn't understand, words in that ancient tongue the cult uses. And the professor. Stokes's voice broke, and he took several breaths before continuing. The professor stepped into the darkness and vanished. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, as though he'd never existed at all. And the doorway closed behind him, sealed itself, and the red lights in the sky faded and disappeared, and the ceremony ended in silence rather than with the usual closing invocations. Because everyone present understood that something unprecedented had occurred, something that changed the nature of everything they thought they understood about the rituals they'd been performing. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute and profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the broken panel above, and the soft, rhythmic sound of our own breathing. I found myself struggling to process what I had heard, my rational mind rebelling against implications of doors to other realms and disappearances into darkness, yet unable to dismiss the testimony outright, given the sincerity with which it had been delivered, and the corroborating physical evidence scattered throughout the observatory. The ritual markings, the grimoire, the professor's own notes, speaking of patterns and convergences and things watching from spaces between. Holmes broke the silence at last, his voice thoughtful and measured. Then the question becomes, not where Professor Ashworth is, but whether retrieval remains possible. If the doorway opened once, presumably it can open again. The cult's ceremonies follow astronomical schedules, dates determined by the positions of celestial bodies. When is the next such alignment? When does the crimson star appear again? Blackthorne consulted some internal calendar, his weathered face creasing with concentration. "Not for another month," he said finally. "The ceremonies follow lunar cycles and stellar positions both. The next convergence, the next time the doorway could potentially open, would be," he calculated silently, "December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night, when darkness holds greatest power. December 21st. The date resonated through the observatory's cold study, like a bell tolling in some distant tower, marking time toward an event both inevitable and impossible to fully comprehend. I watched Miss Ashworth's face as she absorbed this information, saw her move through shock toward something harder, more determined, the transformation of grief into purpose, of uncertainty into resolve. She lifted her chin slightly, that gesture a preparation for difficult decisions, and when she spoke, her voice carried no tremor of doubt. "Then we have a month to prepare," she said, addressing Holmes directly, acknowledging him as the architect of whatever plan might emerge from these extraordinary circumstances. "A month to understand the cult's practices, to learn what we can of the rituals and their purposes, to determine whether this doorway can be traversed in both directions, or whether it opens only one way, into darkness without possibility of return." Holmes nodded slowly, his grey eyes reflecting something I recognized from our most challenging cases, that peculiar mixture of intellectual excitement and moral gravity that arose when investigation transcended the merely criminal and touched upon questions of existence itself. He moved to the window, gazing out into fog that had grown so thick it seemed almost solid, a grey wall that erased distinction between earth and sky, between near and far, transforming the world beyond the glass into abstraction. "We shall need Father Whitmore's cooperation," he said quietly, as though speaking to the fog rather than to those of us gathered in the room. "Or at minimum, we need his tolerance of our presence at the winter solstice ceremony. He must be made to understand that our interest is not in exposing or destroying the cult, but in recovering Professor Ashworth, if recovery proves possible. Miss Ashworth, I believe your uncle's relationship with the father, whatever its nature, gives you claim to participation in whatever occurs on that longest night. We must leverage that claim carefully, present ourselves not as threats, but as petitioners seeking understanding." A china teacup that had been sitting on a shelf suddenly slipped from its perch, perhaps dislodged by some vibration in the building's old timbers, and fell to the floor where it shattered completely, its fragments scattering across the worn boards with sounds like diminutive bells announcing transition from one state to another. The breaking seemed almost symbolic, a punctuation mark in our deliberations, and I found myself staring at the scattered pieces as though they might arrange themselves into some meaningful pattern, some message written in porcelain shards. Blackthorne and Stokes began gathering their coats, preparing to depart now that their testimony had been given, and their consciences at least partially unburdened. But before they could leave, Holmes turned from the window and addressed them with unexpected gentleness. "You have shown considerable courage in speaking to us today, and I want you to understand that your words will not be repeated beyond those who need to hear them. Your position in Thornfield Cross need not be compromised by this conversation. However, I would ask one final favour, that you speak with Father Whitmore on our behalf. Explain that we come seeking knowledge rather than judgment, reunion rather than revelation of secrets. Can you do this for us?" The two men exchanged glances, some silent negotiation occurring between them, before Blackthorn nodded slowly. "Aye, we can do that much. Can't promise the father will listen, mind you. He guards the mysteries jealously, has his whole life, same as his father before him. But we'll speak to him, explain your purpose as best we understand it ourselves. What happens after that?" He shrugged, a gesture encompassing vast uncertainty. "That's between you and him and whatever powers watch from the spaces beyond the stars." After they had departed, their footsteps fading into the muffling fog, the three of us remained in the observatory's study, surrounded by evidence of Professor Ashworth's life and work. His books and instruments, his notes and calculations, the physical residue of a mind devoted to understanding cosmic mysteries that had ultimately consumed him. Miss Ashworth moved slowly through the space, touching objects with careful fingers, perhaps seeking connection with her uncle through these material remnants, these tools of his vanished presence. Holmes returned to the grimoire, opening it once more to study pages he had marked earlier, his brow furrowed in concentration as he absorbed whatever knowledge the ancient text contained. I found myself drawn to the window, watching fog drift past in slow currents, and I thought about doorways between worlds, about the human hunger for knowledge that pushes against boundaries of the known and comfortable, about the price we pay for understanding things perhaps meant to remain mysterious. Time passed in contemplative silence, each of us processing in our own way the extraordinary events and revelations of the morning. Eventually, Holmes closed the grimoire with a soft sound and looked up, his expression thoughtful. "We should return to the village," he said. "There is nothing more to be learned here today, and we have much to consider, many preparations to make before the solstice. Miss Ashworth, I suggest you gather any of your uncle's personal effects you wish to preserve. We may not have opportunity to return before the ceremony, and I think you would want some tangible connection to him, some reminder of the man he was before cosmic mysteries claimed his attention." The walk back to Thornfield Cross felt longer than our morning ascent, though perhaps that was merely perception shaped by the fog's disorienting effects and the weight of knowledge we now carried. The village materialized gradually from grey obscurity, its stone buildings emerging like ships from mist, and I was struck again by how ordinary it appeared, how completely it concealed the extraordinary events that unfolded in the wild places beyond its boundaries. We saw few villagers on the street, and those we encountered passed quickly, with eyes averted, as though our presence had become something to be avoided, a contamination of normalcy's careful preservation. The Thornfield Inn welcomed us with its familiar warmth and the smell of baking bread, Mrs. Blackwood meeting us in the entrance hall with an expression that suggested she had already heard of our morning's activities. News travelled swiftly in small communities, passing through channels invisible to outsiders. She said nothing, however, merely showed us to the dining room, where she had prepared a late lunch, and it was only as we settled at the table that she spoke, her voice low and measured. "Father Whitmore will see you," she said, setting down plates of cold meat and cheese, fresh bread and butter. "This evening, after Vespers, at the church, Tom Blackthorn came by while you were still at the observatory. Said you'd be wanting to speak with the father about—" She paused, searching for appropriate words. "About winter matters." The father agreed, though he asked me to tell you that such conversations have conditions, that certain things discussed cannot be undiscussed. Certain knowledge once gained cannot be returned to ignorance. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. Please convey our gratitude to Father Whitmore, and our acceptance of whatever conditions he deems necessary. We understand that we approach mysteries not lightly held, and we respect the gravity of what we seek to understand. The afternoon drifted past in a kind of suspended time, hours that felt simultaneously endless and impossibly swift. I spent some portion of it resting in my room, though sleep eluded me, my mind too full of stone circles and crimson stars, of doorways opening onto impossible elsewheres, and men stepping through into darkness that might be oblivion, or might be something stranger still. Through my window, I could see the church tower rising above the village rooftops, its weathered stones solid and enduring, and I wondered what secrets its foundation concealed, what chambers lay beneath its altar, holding grimoires and ancient knowledge passed down through generations of keepers. As evening approached, the fog began to lift slightly, though full darkness came early in this northern latitude, in this late November season, when night claimed the greater portion of each 24-hour cycle. Holmes knocked at my door just as I was preparing to descend, and together we collected Miss Ashworth from her room, the three of us making our way through streets now largely empty, the village seemingly holding its breath as we walked toward our appointment with the Keeper of Mysteries. The church stood before us at last, its Norman architecture simple and dignified, its door massive oak bound with iron that had weathered centuries. Holmes pushed it open, the hinges protesting with sounds that echoed through the interior. A single large chamber with thick stone columns supporting a vaulted ceiling, rows of wooden pews facing an altar adorned simply with candles and a plain wooden cross. The space smelled of old stone and candle wax, of prayer absorbed into walls over countless generations. And despite my knowledge of what lay hidden here, I felt the peace that ancient sacred spaces can inspire, that sense of connection to something larger than individual existence. Father Whitmore emerged from a side door, a tall figure in simple clerical garb, his face lined with age, yet retaining an alertness, an intelligence that suggested minds undimmed by years. His eyes, when they fixed on us, were neither welcoming nor hostile, but rather assessing, measuring us against some internal standard known only to himself. He gestured for us to follow him, leading us not to the altar, but to that same side door from which he had appeared, down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footfalls, into chambers that lay beneath the church proper. The room into which we descended felt simultaneously ancient and alive, its walls lined with shelves holding volumes similar to the grimoire we had found in the observatory, their leather bindings cracked with age, their pages yellow and fragile. A table occupied the center of the space, and on it lay astronomical charts, ritual diagrams, and instruments whose purposes I could only guess at, brass astrolabes and crystal spheres, candles marked with strange symbols, and papers covered in calculations that mixed mathematics with mystical notation. Father Whitmore gestured for us to sit, though he remained standing, his hands clasped before him in a posture that might have been prayer, or might simply have been his habitual stance. When he spoke, his voice carried the resonance of someone accustomed to filling spaces with words meant to be heard and heeded. "You seek Professor Ashworth," he said, statement rather than question. "You believe he can be recovered from where he has gone. brought back through the doorway he entered. "I admire your determination, Miss Ashworth. Your refusal to accept loss as final. It speaks well of your devotion to family. But you must understand what you ask, what you propose to attempt." Miss Ashworth leaned forward, her entire being focused on the priest's words. "But he did step through," she said. "He crossed from this world to whatever lies beyond. If he could make that journey, surely the reverse is possible. Surely on the winter solstice, when the doorway opens again, someone could pass through to find him, to guide him back." Father Whitmore's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been compassion or might have been pity. "The doorway permits passage, yes, but those who cross carry no guarantee of return, no assurance that the path leads anywhere but deeper into labyrinths that fold reality into shapes human minds were not designed to navigate. I cannot stop you from attempting what you propose, Miss Ashworth. The winter solstice ceremony will occur regardless, as it has occurred on that date since before this church was built, since before Christianity named this ground sacred, though it was already holy to older worship. You may attend, may position yourselves at the threshold when the doorway manifests, but I will not pretend such an attempt lacks terrible risk, nor that success is more likely than catastrophic failure." The conversation continued for some time after that, Holmes asking detailed questions about the ritual's mechanics, about the timing and precise nature of the doorway's manifestation, about what provisions might be made for someone attempting to cross with intention of return. Father Whitmore answered with remarkable candour, perhaps recognizing that withholding information would not deter us, but merely increase the danger of our eventual attempt. He spoke of ancient texts, of patterns observed across centuries, of the handful of people who had crossed the threshold, and the even smaller number who had returned, invariably changed by whatever they had witnessed in the spaces between. We left the church as full darkness settled over Thornfield Cross, the stars beginning to emerge in gaps between clouds that drifted across the sky like thoughts across a dreaming mind. Walking back to the inn, I found myself looking upward, searching the heavens for any sign of the crimson star or its heralds, seeing only familiar constellations wheeling in their ancient patterns, eternal and indifferent to human dramas played out beneath their light. The month ahead would require preparation, both practical and psychological, would demand that we steel ourselves for an attempt that might succeed or fail in ways we could not predict. But the decision had been made, the commitment undertaken. On the winter solstice, we would stand within the stone circle on Crimson Fell. We would participate in ceremonies older than memory, and we would attempt to recover a man who had stepped through a doorway into mystery, leaving behind only questions and the faint hope that love and determination might prove stronger than the vast gulfs between worlds. If you found comfort in this journey through mystery and starlight, if these quiet hours have helped ease your mind toward rest, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, leave a like to let me know this story resonated with you, and share your thoughts in the comments about what mysteries you'd like to explore together in future tales. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and may you wake refreshed to face whatever mysteries tomorrow brings. Good night, dear traveller, and may the stars watch over you with kindness, until we meet again in stories yet to be told. Rest well,